It was 3 years ago when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Mojave Desert. I had always been drawn to the vast, open landscapes, the way the sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple at dusk. The solitude was appealing, a chance to escape the noise of everyday life. My name is Jake, and I was a 28-year-old graphic designer living in Los Angeles. I had spent too many hours cooped up in front of a computer screen, and I craved adventure. I spent weeks planning my route, studying maps, and gathering supplies. I packed my backpack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my trusty camera. The plan was to hike for 3 days, camping under the stars and soaking in the beauty of nature. I felt prepared and excited as I drove out of the city and into the desert. The first day went smoothly. The sun shone brightly overhead as I trekked along the trail, surrounded by towering cacti and rugged rock formations. I took pictures and marveled at the unique landscape. As evening approached, I set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by boulders. The air cooled, and I built a small fire to ward off the chill while I cooked my dinner. That night, as I lay in my tent watching the stars twinkle above, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It was just me in the desert, a world away from work deadlines and city life. However, that tranquility was short-lived. The next morning, I awoke to a brilliant sunrise painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. After breakfast, I packed up my gear and continued on my journey. As I hiked deeper into the desert, the terrain became more challenging. The trails were less defined, and I found myself navigating through rocky outcrops and sandy washes. Around midday, I came across a fork in the trail. One path led to a popular lookout point known for its stunning views. The other appeared less traveled but seemed to lead towards some intriguing rock formations in the distance. My curiosity got the better of me, and I chose the less popular route. As I ventured further down this new path, it became increasingly difficult to follow. The sun beat down relentlessly, and soon enough, my water supply began to dwindle. I checked my map, but realized that my phone had lost signal hours ago. There were no landmarks to guide me back. By late afternoon, panic began to creep in as I realized how far off course I'd gone. The sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon when I finally decided it was time to turn back. As I retraced my steps, everything started to look eerily similar yet unfamiliar at once. The shadows grew longer as dusk approached. Each rock formation seemed like a ghostly figure watching me wander aimlessly. I picked up my pace, but soon realized that my sense of direction was failing me. With every step taken back toward where I thought I'd come from, it felt like I was walking deeper into an endless maze of sand and stone. As darkness fell over the desert landscape, desperation set in. My water bottle was nearly empty now, and my throat felt parched from the heat of the day. It was then that I heard it, a faint sound echoing through the stillness of night. At first it was indistinct, a rustling or perhaps even whispers carried by the wind. But as I strained to listen closer, it morphed into something more distinct, footsteps crunching on gravel nearby. I stopped dead in my tracks. Fear surged through me as thoughts raced through my mind. Was someone else out here? Had they gotten lost too? Or worse, were they following me? I crouched behind a large boulder for cover as my mind raced with possibilities. The footsteps grew louder. They sounded heavy, deliberate, and they were getting closer. I peered around the boulder cautiously, but saw nothing but darkness stretching endlessly before me. My instincts told me to stay hidden until whatever it was passed by. Minutes felt like hours as silence enveloped me once more after those footsteps faded away into nothingness. When dawn broke over the horizon again, illuminating everything around me with its harsh light, I knew staying put wasn't an option anymore. My water supply had dwindled to just a few drops left in my bottle. Dehydration would soon become an issue if I didn't find help. I set off again with renewed determination, despite feeling disoriented from lack of sleep and water. Every step felt heavier than before, as fatigue weighed down on me like an anchor pulling me deeper into despair. After wandering aimlessly for what seemed like hours under that relentless sun again, my throat dry and cracked, I stumbled upon what appeared to be an old dirt road leading away from where I'd been wandering aimlessly all night long. With no other options left available before me, no signs of civilization or any other hikers, I decided this road might lead somewhere promising after all. As I followed it cautiously while keeping an eye out for any potential dangers lurking nearby, my thoughts drifted back toward those mysterious footsteps from last night. Who were they? Did they know something about this place that could help me? The road twisted through arid land, dotted with sparse vegetation, a stark reminder of how desolate this area truly was, but eventually led me toward what appeared like an abandoned gas station up ahead. Hope surged within me as adrenaline kicked in at seeing signs of human presence after so long alone in this wilderness. But as I approached closer, the sight turned sour quickly when realization hit hard. Broken windows lined its walls, faded advertisements peeled away from time's cruel grasp. No one had been here for years. I stepped inside cautiously, half expecting someone might jump out at any moment, but there were only remnants left behind. Dusty shelves filled with expired snacks, rusted tools scattered across floors littered with debris accumulated over time without care or attention given by anyone who might have once visited this place long ago. Frustration bubbled within me again. This wasn't going according to plan. Just when despair threatened to overwhelm me once more, I heard something outside again, this time louder than before. I rushed outside only to see a figure standing there, a man dressed in tattered clothes staring blankly at me from across what remained of this gas station lot. "Help!" I shouted instinctively, but he didn't respond right away. Just stood there silently observing me like some ghostly apparition conjured forth by my own imagination. Finally, breaking his silence, he spoke softly. "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down my spine as realization dawned upon me. He wasn't just another lost soul like myself. There was something deeply unsettling about him. "Get back inside," he warned urgently now. "You don't want them finding you out here." "Who?" But before he could answer, a low growl echoed from behind him, sending shivers coursing through every fiber within me. Suddenly, all those fears came rushing back. The footsteps, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted. It all made sense now. With no time left for questions, I turned on my heels, sprinting away from that gas station toward wherever fate would lead next. I don't remember much after that, just fragments of fear-driven adrenaline propelling me forward through endless stretches of sand until finally collapsing under exhaustion when night fell once more. Days later, I woke up surrounded by search teams who'd been looking for me after friends reported my absence. Relief washed over them, but confusion clouded their faces when hearing about what happened during those terrifying days alone amidst desolation. 3 years later, I still think about that trip often. How quickly things can spiral out of control when faced with nature's unforgiving landscape, and how sometimes even our greatest adventures can turn into nightmares. A few years ago, my friend Liam and I decided to take a camping trip out to the Sonoran Desert. It was his idea, of course. Liam was always chasing some kind of adventure, whether it was hiking, climbing, or finding some remote place to explore. I wasn't as outdoorsy as he was, but I agreed. Life had been stressful, and the thought of spending a weekend away from the noise of the city sounded appealing. The campsite Liam picked was deep in the desert, far from any main roads or towns. He'd read about it online, a secluded spot surrounded by rocky outcrops and towering saguaros. "It'll be amazing," he said as we packed up the car with our tent, sleeping bags, and enough food and water for 2 days. The drive out there was uneventful at first. The paved roads gave way to dirt paths, and soon we were surrounded by nothing but sand, rocks, and cacti. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was already dipping low on the horizon. The place was as remote as Liam had promised. There wasn't another soul in sight. We chose a spot near a cluster of rocks that offered some shade from the late afternoon sun. Setting up the tent took longer than expected. The ground was hard and uneven, but eventually we got everything in place. As darkness fell, we lit a small fire and cooked dinner. Just some canned soup and bread we'd brought along. The stars that night were incredible. Without any light pollution, the sky seemed endless, filled with constellations I'd never noticed before. Liam was in his element, snapping photos with his camera and talking about how peaceful it all was. I wanted to feel the same way, but something about the silence felt oppressive. We stayed up for a while by the fire before finally turning in for the night. The wind rustled softly through the brush outside as we zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound outside the tent, a faint crunching noise like footsteps on gravel. At first, I thought it might just be an animal passing through, a coyote or maybe a jackrabbit, but then I heard it again. It wasn't random like an animal's movements, it sounded deliberate. "Liam," I whispered, nudging him awake. "Do you hear that?" He stirred groggily beside me before sitting up to listen. The noise had stopped by then, leaving only silence behind. "Probably just an animal," he mumbled before lying back down again. I wanted to believe him, but something about those sounds didn't sit right with me. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening for anything unusual, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I drifted off again. The next morning, we woke up to find our campsite disturbed. The firewood we'd gathered had been scattered across the ground, and one of our water bottles was missing from where we'd left it near the tent. "What the hell?" Liam said as he surveyed the mess. "Do you still think it's just animals?" I asked. He frowned but didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said finally, though he didn't sound convinced. We cleaned up quickly and decided to go for a hike to clear our heads. Liam wanted to explore some nearby rock formations he'd spotted on our way in, so we grabbed our packs and set off. We spent most of the day hiking through the desert, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting among the rocks, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, we decided to head back to camp before it got dark again. As we approached our tent, though, something felt wrong. "Did you leave that open?" Liam asked suddenly. I followed his gaze and saw that one side of our tent flap was unzipped, something neither of us had done. "No," I said quietly. Before either of us could react further, a man stepped out from behind one of the nearby rocks. He looked rough. His clothes were dirty and torn, his face gaunt and weathered from too much time in the sun. In his hands was a rifle pointed directly at us. "Don't move," he said flatly. Liam froze beside me as my mind raced for what to do next. "We don't want any trouble," I said carefully. The man didn't lower his weapon. "You're trespassing," he said. "This is my land." "We didn't know," Liam said quickly. "We just wanted a place to camp." The man sneered. "Ignorance isn't an excuse. Leave your supplies and get out." I glanced at Liam, his jaw tightened slightly as he nodded at me. "All right," I said slowly as I set my pack down on the ground. Liam did the same while keeping his eyes on the man's rifle. The man stepped forward cautiously to grab our supplies while still keeping his weapon trained on us. "You have 5 minutes," he said once he had everything in hand. We didn't wait around to argue. We turned and started walking back toward where we'd parked without looking back. When we finally reached the car and drove away from that place, neither of us spoke for a long time. The relief didn't hit until we were miles away from that campsite. We never went back to that desert again. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. The desert has always been a part of me, in a way. I'm Ben, and I grew up in a small town bordering the Mojave. I knew the stories, the dangers, and the beauty. I thought I was prepared. That's what makes what happened out there so unnerving. I was overconfident, and the desert took advantage. My wife Lisa and I had been married for 5 years. City life was grinding us down, the endless cycle of work, bills, and traffic taking its toll. We needed a break, a chance to reconnect. A road trip through the desert seemed like the perfect escape. We packed our SUV with camping gear, water, and enough snacks to last for days. We planned to drive across the Mojave, stopping at scenic overlooks and historical sites along the way. It was supposed to be a relaxing, romantic adventure. The first few days were wonderful. We hiked through canyons, watched breathtaking sunsets, and marveled at the vastness of the desert landscape. We even found a secluded spot to camp under the stars. It was exactly the escape we had been looking for. Then we made a mistake. We decided to take a shortcut, a dirt road that promised to shave a few hours off our journey. The road was rough and bumpy, and the landscape became increasingly desolate. We saw no other cars or signs of civilization, just endless sand and rock stretching to the horizon. As the sun began to set, the wind picked up. The sky turned an eerie shade of yellow, and a thick cloud of dust began to swirl around us. It wasn't long before we realized that we were in the middle of a sandstorm. Visibility dropped to near zero. The wind howled, and sand pelted our car with relentless force. We pulled over to the side of the road, hoping to wait out the storm, but it only seemed to get worse. "Maybe we should try to turn around," Lisa said, her tone laced with apprehension. "I can't see anything," I replied. "We'll just have to wait it out." We sat in the car listening to the wind and sand, feeling increasingly trapped and vulnerable. It was then that we heard it. A faint scratching sound came from outside the car. At first, I dismissed it as wind blowing sand against metal, but then I heard it again, louder this time, like someone dragging their fingernails across the car door. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered. "It's just the wind," I said, trying to reassure her and myself. But the scratching continued, growing more insistent as it moved around the car, scraping against windows and roof. The sound unnerved me. It sent chills down my spine. I switched on the headlights in an attempt to see what was out there, but the storm was too thick. All I could see was a swirling wall of sand. "There's something out there," Lisa said, her voice tight with fear. The scratching stopped abruptly and was replaced by a rhythmic thumping, as if someone were hitting our car with their hands. I fumbled for my pocket knife. My hands felt clumsy with fear. I knew it wasn't much, but it was all I had to defend us if things went south. Then came a voice from outside. "Let me in, please." I looked at Lisa. She looked back at me with wide eyes. "Who are you?" I shouted back into the storm. "I'm lost. Just let me in," he pleaded. Against my better judgment, I opened a small window just enough to hear him better over the howling wind. "Please, I ran out of water. I need help," he gasped between breaths. I hesitated. There was something about his desperation that tugged at my instincts as a human being. But then I remembered how dangerous this place could be, how quickly things could turn ugly in isolation like this. "Why are you out here?" I asked cautiously. "I got separated from my friends," he said rapidly. "They were driving ahead when we hit this storm." I glanced at Lisa. She looked terrified but also sympathetic. "What do you want us to do?" "Just let me in. I swear I'm not dangerous," he insisted. I opened the door slightly, but kept my foot against it to prevent him from forcing his way inside if he tried anything suspicious. As soon as he stepped inside, he looked exhausted but not threatening, yet. "I'm sorry," he said breathlessly as he collapsed into our back seat without waiting for an invitation. "I thought I'd die out there." Lisa's eyes darted between me and him as uncertainty hung heavy in the air. "You can't stay here," I said firmly but quietly so as not to provoke him further. "We're trapped too." "I know," he replied weakly as he slumped back against his seat while catching his breath. "But you have water." "Yeah," Lisa said hesitantly as she reached for our supply bag while keeping an eye on him. As she handed him a bottle of water, he gulped it down greedily before looking back at us with gratitude mixed with desperation etched on his face. "Thank you," he said softly after finishing half of it in one go before handing back what remained. Just when we thought we were safe for a moment longer, the man suddenly shifted his demeanor entirely. He pulled out a knife from his pocket with alarming speed. "Give me everything you have," he shouted, his voice now filled with aggression as he pointed it toward us. Lisa gasped while instinctively moving closer to me. My mind raced as adrenaline surged through my veins. "Wait, let's talk about this," I urged while keeping my hands raised defensively, trying not to provoke him further. But he wasn't interested in talking. His eyes were wild with desperation and fear as if survival depended on what we had. "Just give me your wallets, now." With no other choice, I reached into my pocket slowly, my heart pounding as I pulled out my wallet while keeping my gaze fixed on him. He watched intently, his grip tightening around that knife while Lisa fumbled nervously beside me. Suddenly, just as quickly as it had started, the storm began to calm down outside. The winds died down gradually until all that remained was an eerie silence enveloping us within that vehicle. Realizing this might be our chance, I took advantage of his distraction. With one swift motion, I lunged forward, grabbing hold of his wrist while trying desperately to wrestle that knife away from him. We struggled fiercely within those cramped quarters until finally, I managed to knock it free, sending it clattering across our seats. In that moment, he panicked. He bolted out of our car into the vast void outside, disappearing into nothingness. We sat there breathing heavily, shocked by what had just transpired. Minutes later, the storm fully subsided, and we cautiously stepped outside, looking around frantically, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The desert stretched endlessly before us, a stark reminder of how quickly things could turn dangerous when least expected. That day changed everything for us, not just because of how close we came facing danger together, but also because sometimes even our greatest adventures can turn into nightmares when least expected.